Thank you for joining us today for this special webinar. My name's Eileen Burke, and I'm the current president for the Preservation Association of Lincoln. Our program today is titled Getting to Know SHPO, and it's hosted by the Preservation Association of Lincoln and also Restoration Exchange Omaha, the preservation nonprofit for the city of Omaha. The Nebraska State Historical Preservation Office, is also known as SHPO, was created through the Historic Preservation Act in 1966. The SHPO plays a critical role carrying out the responsibilities of the federal historic preservation law at the state level, whether it is guiding citizens through the process of listing important historic resources or neighborhoods on the National Register of Historic Places, or considering the impact of large renewable energy projects on historic landscapes or archaeology sites. Your SHPO is your partner in preservation. Today, members of the SHPO, Nebraska SHPO, David Cleese, Kelly Bacon, and Ryan Reed will discuss 3 programs offered by their organization: the National Register of Historic Places, Certified Local Government, and Historic Tax Incentives. David's up first, and David has served as the National Register Coordinator for the State Historic Preservation Office at History Nebraska for the past 3.5 years. He enjoys working with property owners and representatives to recognize the historic significance of their properties and communities. Kelly Bacon is a certified local government coordinator in the State Historic Preservation Office at History Nebraska, a position she has held for 4 years. She enjoys outreach and working with communities of all shapes and sizes to help them reach their preservation goals. And then Ryan Reed has worked as a tax incentive coordinator in the State Historic Preservation Office at History Nebraska for the past 6 years. He currently manages 3 incentive programs offered by the federal and state governments. There'll be time at the end for questions. And this is brought to you, as we mentioned, by PAL, and Preservation Association of Lincoln brings you these programs. So you can join our membership and by going to preservelincoln.org. David, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Eileen. So yes, my name is David Cleese. I am the coordinator for the National Register of Historic Places program at the Nebraska SHPO. People think of our program and they say, you know, the people that we give out the plaques, even though we don't give them out, but you know, people know our buildings and our resources in the National Register, typically because they're going through a neighborhood or a downtown and they see plaques on certain buildings that recognize them as historic. And that's just one incredibly small facet of what the National Register is, or a small byproduct. So next slide, please. So what is the National Register of Historic Places? There's a lot of myths out there, and I'm not going to get into all of those today, but it's an honorary list of properties that are worthy of preservation. There's no restriction on property owners' rights. We hear that a lot. We're like, I don't want to do this because there's all these rules. I ask people, well, what are the rules that you have to follow? And they either tell me ones that aren't true, or they even say, I don't know, but I know there's rules. And so that's a huge myth, and that's a huge deterrent to people being interested in listing their resources. Any restrictions or it's all through local ordinances, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But there is no restrictions based solely on the National Register. So there is some review from a federal undertaking standpoint, and that's where Section 106 comes into play. But if you're a private property owner, you can do what you want without calling us or asking us. Of course, we hope that you would contact us and that you take appropriate preservation methods and process into play, but there's no requirement for that. We also don't have any money to hand out. People call me, they want grants, they want funds. I talked to them about the National Register, then I mentioned Ryan's program to them, and he's going to discuss that in a few minutes. So we don't hand out money. We also don't restrict y'all. And the other thing is that the National Register, I've had people say, well, how in the world did that get in the National Register? That looks like, that's not a very attractive building. And it's not the National Register of pretty places or cool buildings. It is of historic places, and history happens in all sorts of places, whether it's a building and if it isn't a building, whether it's really ornate, elaborate, or if it's very plain and you almost kind of don't even notice it when you drive by it. So that's just a really brief overview of what is or what isn't the National Register. Next slide, please. So how do we determine if something is eligible for listing? I get this all the time. People call me or email me asking me about their property. A lot of times they say, well, my building's 75 years old, let's put it on the list. And it's like, well, that's not what we do. Typically, we look at a 50-year kind of a trigger point. The resource has to be that age, or more importantly, the history that makes it significant has to happen without the last 50 years. So if your building's 60 years old, but something significant happened at 35 years old, we're still not there. We're looking for a 50-year cutoff. And that's just so we can appropriately distance ourselves from the event or from whatever it is to accurately assess it. So the property has to be associated with with an important historic context. It can't just be old. It has to be something significant. And then it also has to retain its integrity from that time period where it achieved its significance. So that's what we look at, is significance and integrity. Next slide, please. So what are the different criteria for evaluation? There's four of them that we look at. For the National Register, you only have to be eligible under one of these. You don't have to be eligible under multiple. And frankly, being listed in the National Register is kind of like a pass-fail. If you're listed, you're listed. It doesn't matter if you're listed under 3 of them and your neighbor's only listed under 1, you don't get any extra benefit. Listed is listed. So criterion A is events, patterns, or themes in history. We see this a lot. Specifically, we're doing a lot with commerce, commercial properties, just the larger historic context. We do transportation, association with, cross-country highways, the Lincoln Highway and DLD resources along in that context. Significant people is criterion B. And we look at resources that are tied to that individual's productive life. So not necessarily so-and-so's boyhood home. If he or she's significant in something, that they did in their 40s and 50s, we look at their productive life, a resource that's tied to what they actually are significant for. Criterion C is architecture. And this is where the whole National Register of Pretty Places comes into play, because everybody, a lot of people think of, the Victorian homes or the large stately government buildings that are really ornate. Criterion C covers a lot of different things. We're not going to get into all those today in the limited amount of time that we have, but you can see there's a lot of different, that's a really long definition because we're looking at type and period or method. We're talking about works of a master, artistic values. And so there's a lot that goes into criterion C, but that's our basic architecture and sometimes engineering criterion. And then criterion D is for information of potential. Most often this is tied to archaeology. National Register is really diverse in the fact that we list, and we'll discuss this in a moment, but we also list archaeological sites, and especially here in Nebraska, that's extremely important to our history. We have a very short settlement period. We're looking at 150, 170 years roughly. And so we have a wealth of resources in this state that are archaeological, and they're just really important to our state's history as a whole. So next slide, please. So then there's categories of resources that we look at. It's not just buildings and houses. So that's kind of the most common that we're most familiar with, but we also do structures, and you have some definitions and some examples there on your screen. One of the ones, that was one of the most fun to work on recently was a water tower out in Garden County. First water tower that we've listed in Nebraska. So that was kind of interesting. And that goes back to that criterion C as an engineering significance. It was a certain style of water tower that they used in the early 20th century. So buildings, structures, objects. There's a park fountain that's an object as an example that's listed in Alliance. And so there's some versatility there. Next slide, please. And then the sites, as I previously mentioned, typically archaeological sites. We've done a POW camp that was a site as well as a city park was a site that had a number of objects within it. And then also districts. If you have a collection of resources, whether it's commercial, residential, or industrial in nature, also archaeological districts as well. Instead of doing 17 different nominations, you could do one as a district, as a collection, and that can also bring in a lot of other resources that aren't individually significant. So it's kind of more of a bang for your buck type approach. So we do a lot of commercial downtown districts. That's what we've been focusing on now to for the tax incentives. Next slide, please. So if you have if you're interested in having a resource, evaluated and eventually listed in the National Register, it is a process. This isn't a list that you give me your name, address, in a picture, and I put it in a spreadsheet and we're done. You can see down at the bottom, the fastest that we typically can do this is 6 months. And that's if you're really on top of it, or you have a hired consultant, and everything basically falls where it needs to. But I would plan for at least a year, roughly a year from start to finish, if not longer, depending on the complexity of your resource. So the first thing we need to do is evaluate the resource. We don't know everything about every building in the state. So we need information from the public. So contact us. We have a preliminary form, fill that out. I'll evaluate it and, based on the information provided. So I can only evaluate what I have and what I know. So the more information I get, the better I can evaluate a resource. If it is eligible and we move forward with preparing a nomination, anyone can prepare it. We typically don't. We don't have the staff and the time to do that, but I'm here to work with y'all on that. We do a number of drafts. If you have questions, ask. You can hire a consultant. You can do it with a volunteer group or a property owner. The National Park Service has bulletins, and of course, these are government bulletins. They're not the most exciting thing to read, but they are helpful. They are a little bit dated at times too. So use the bulletins, work with our office. We're here to help people prepare these nominations, get the nominations ready to be submitted to our state board meeting, our state board at the 3 meetings they hold each year. And you see that on the screen here, January, May, and September. The board reviews the nominations. They discuss them at the meeting. Once they're approved, we forward them to the National Park Service. They have the final review and the disposition. They have 45 business days to do that. And then they are the ones who officially list resources in the National Register. And then, as I said, this is not a, hey, I'm fixing to start work in a month and I want to get this thing listed so I can do tax credits. You need to plan ahead. It takes time. It just does. If you want to do a project or you're thinking about doing a project, I would start researching and reaching out to our office for evaluation sooner rather than later. And I think that's the last slide that I have. Thank you.
Yes, I am Kelly Bacon. I am the Certified Local Government Program Coordinator in SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. So next slide, please. So what is the Certified Local Government Program? And I'm going to refer to it as CLG because it's a much shorter acronym and way to say the program. So it is a preservation assistance program for communities and counties. And then it provides a statewide and national network of communities and counties that have similar preservation goals. And it's, designed to work in communities and counties of all shapes and sizes. And it provides a way to protect historic properties in your community. Like Dave said, the National Register doesn't come with restrictions for private property owners. And if they're using their own money, they can do whatever they want. This is a way that this program can provide a way to protect some of your historic resources. And it's a way to sustain and build strong communities through historic preservation and economic development opportunities, heritage tourism opportunities, that sort of thing. So next slide, please. We currently have 8 CLGs in Nebraska. They are Auburn, Fairbury, Lincoln, North Platte, Omaha, Plattsmouth, Red Cloud, and Sydney. So even just within our 8 CLGs in the state, we have multiple populations and they're dispersed across the state. So, and we are, always, trying to recruit new communities to join the program. And across the US, there are over 2,000 CLGs. And again, of all shapes and sizes, the smallest communities that I know of that are CLGs have a population of about 50 people. So it's really designed to work anywhere. So next slide, please. There are 5 general requirements for a community to be certified as a CLG. They need to pass a preservation ordinance, and that ordinance will provide for the protection of historic properties. And I'm not going to speak a lot about this or anything. I could talk about it forever, but what historic resources are important to your community and how do you want to protect them? It could be that you would have a review of demolition of your historic properties. It could be that you want to review certain exterior changes, like new windows or putting solar panels on the roof or additions or new siding, those sorts of things. So it's that sort of language in your ordinance is up to the community. Our office is here to act as a guide, but it's really going to be up to you. And so be Lincoln and Omaha, since we're talking about those communities today, mostly their ordinances do have some design review for exterior changes. So that ordinance will establish a historic preservation commission or a historic preservation board. And in the case of Omaha, I think it's the Landmarks Heritage Preservation Commission is their official title. And it's a commission with at least 5 people who have an expertise or an interest in historic preservation, architecture, history, archaeology, those real estate, construction, those sorts of fields. And you will also be allowed, you have the ability to survey in your community. One of our other programs is our survey program, and that's when we look for historic properties across the state. This will allow you to be able to do your own survey work. And again, I'm not going to go into that a whole lot, but just know that that is a requirement for you to do. And we will give you we have given information to Lincoln and Omaha, and they have done a lot of their own survey work in the community. It also requires you to have public participation and education as part of your duties and programming throughout the year. Your commission is a public body, just like your city council or planning commission, maybe a library board, something like that. So in Lincoln and Omaha, those commission meetings are open to the public. So at a very minimal level, that does meet that requirement, but it's also great when the commissions offer some sort of public education opportunity throughout the year. And the 5th requirement is staff. So we need to have somebody within the city government who oversees the work of the Historic Preservation Commission. And because it is a public body, the meeting agendas and minutes are public records. So somebody that kind of keeps track of that. This it doesn't have to be a full-time position. Lincoln and Omaha have full planning staff and full-time staff. So it's a little bit different there, but it's not required to have a full-time position working on historic preservation or the work of the commission. So next slide, Ryan, please. So some of the duties and abilities of the commission are to comment on National Register nominations that come forth in your district. So in Lincoln and Omaha, and then for our other CLGs, anytime a National Register nomination would be proposed in those communities, the commission gets to review it and then vote if they think it's eligible for listing in the National Register. And that's for individual listings and districts. And then you can also be a consulting party to Section 106 review and compliance projects. Dave briefly mentioned federal undertaking. So this is that if there's federal funding, permitting and licensing, your commission and historic preservation staff can review and consult on those. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of that program. There is, potentially design or demolition review, depending on the language in your ordinance. Like I said, Lincoln and Omaha, they do have design review. Like for the instance of North Platte, they don't do any design review, but they do review demolition of their historic properties. And then public education, opportunities are great too. So next slide, Ryan. Benefits. The city ordinance will establish what's called a local landmarking. And local landmarking is kind of the formal process of determining what your historic resources are. And these are properties then that would be subject to design review in your ordinance. You would establish an ordinance, but that doesn't mean that every single property in your community is subject to that. So in the cases of Lincoln and Omaha, not every single property in those two communities is subject to review in your ordinance. Your ordinance will spell out how you locally landmark individual buildings and districts. And one of the benefits of local landmarking is that those properties could potentially be eligible for the two state tax credit programs, the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit, the NHTC, and the Valuation Incentive Program, VIP. And Ryan will talk in more detail about those programs, but becoming a CLG can open up opportunities for property owners in your jurisdiction, which I think is a great benefit. And we have competitive matching grants available for CLGs for their own preservation projects. The only thing we can't fund is the rehabilitation of actual buildings, but we can help with specs that you may have need to be done. It also pays we can help with training for staff and commission members and opportunities for educating the public. And again, you can apply for grant funding for these programs. And then it's a way to promote historic resources, like I mentioned earlier, with heritage tourism, economic development opportunities, trying to get potential tax credits, availability, and then it can increase community pride and identity and reach those heritage tourists that you want to reach in your community. There are studies that have shown that people who are traveling for heritage tourism will spend more money in your community than in a community that really doesn't promote itself as having historic resources. So I think there might be one more slide. Yep. So these are some of the past projects in Lincoln and Omaha. I didn't list all of them, but Lincoln has done a lot with public education, with brown bags and walking tours. They have done GIS and website development. They've done design standards, which is a great grant project for CLGs to do. They've worked on National Register nominations, and again, with grant funding, and they've completed survey work. Omaha has done a lot of the similar work to Omaha with surveys and National Register nominations. They're currently working on some historic preservation guidelines and design guidelines for both residential and commercial properties. And then they've also done a lot with GIS and website development. And I think that's my last slide. Yep.
Okay, so it's my turn. I'm Ryan Reed. I'm the Tax Incentive Coordinator for the State Historic Preservation Office, the SHPO. I'm also the guy that advances the slides for this presentation. So I'm going to try and quickly tell you about the three different tax incentives that we have that are offered through the federal government and the state government. I've invited Lee Glaser here from the Department of Revenue, the Nebraska Department of Revenue, because one of those programs, the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit, is a partnership program with our office and the Department of Revenue. What we do is we review all the work you're going to be doing to your building. What Revenue does is they look at your expenditures and issue that credit. So she's here to answer any questions you have regarding the tax side of the historic preservation tax credit for the state. So let's get started. So I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. So we have three different tax incentives that are offered. The first one is the federal historic tax credit. And this is a credit toward your federal tax liability equal to 20% of qualified expenditures. So qualified expenditures, what is that? Well, you have your total project costs. That's everything you're throwing into your project, from the roof to windows, floors, HVAC, plumbing, and even landscaping on the exterior. From that, you subtract out your qualified expenditures. Your qualified expenditures deal with the historic fabric of the building, so windows, roof, floors, but it also deals with the mechanics of your building, so HVAC, plumbing fixtures, electrical. And so whatever the qualified expenditures add up to, that is what your 20% credit is calculated to. So you don't get like money right up front for the rehab. It's not like a grant. You have to wait until your project is completed to be issued this credit. With the state, there's two programs. There's the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit. And as I said previously, this is a partnership program between our office and the Nebraska Department of Revenue. Like the Federal Historic Tax Credit, it's a credit towards your state tax liability that's equal to 20% of qualified expenditures. Qualified expenditures are similar to what the feds do. The last one is the Valuation Incentive Program, the VIP program. And this is a property tax freeze for 8 years on the pre-rehab value, and then it increases incrementally for 4 years to the post-rehab value. So this tax freeze doesn't kick in until the calendar year after you complete your project. So if you completed your project in April of 2021, the tax freeze won't kick in until the next calendar year in January 2022. So Kelly and Dave's programs, National Register of Historic Places and CLG, tie into these various programs. With the Federal Historic Tax Credit, you have to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And that's also the same with the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit or the Valuation Incentive Program. With Kelly's program, the CLG, which does local landmarking, if your building is only locally landmarked and not listed on the National Register, you can go after the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit and the Valuation Incentive Program. If your building's locally listed, you can't go after the Federal Historic Tax Credit. Another thing about these is your project has to be income producing. So it has to be generating money somehow. That's true with the Federal Historic Tax Credit, and that's true with the State Historic Tax Credit. The Valuation Incentive Program, you can have an income producing property in order to use it, but you can also use the Valuation Incentive Program on your house. So if you have a rehab project you want to do on your house, the Valuation Incentive Program would be open to you, but not the federal and the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit. So these are 3 different programs, and they each have their own application process. But each part of the process is the same. So basically, information you put in one, you can go ahead and put in the other. The part 1 is the evaluation of significance. And this part of the application presents information about the significance and appearance of the building to prove that it's a certified historic structure. So your building is a certified historic structure if it's listed on the National Register, or it's locally landmarked through a CLG or a city ordinance. With this process, with this application part 1, you need photographs of the inside and outside of your building, and then a photo psyche to show where all these pictures were taken. The part 2, this is the nitty-gritty. This is your description of the rehabilitation. So it describes the current condition of the building and the planned rehabilitation work. And so with the part 2, we need a lot of pictures. You'll submit pictures of the interior and exterior again, and then you'll show detailed shots of windows, of flooring, ceiling, stairways, bathrooms, just to see what condition they're all in. These will be keyed to a photo key. And then you also need architectural drawings. You'll have to show in those architectural drawings the existing condition, where walls exist, and then what you're proposing to demo, and then your proposed build out. So that's a lot of information you have to put in there. But once that is approved, you can start your work. Once you've completed all the work, you move on to your part 3. So when everything's done, you can file a part 3, which is your certification of completed work. Basically what this is a lot of pictures, again, of the inside and outside, and it basically proves, yeah, what we said we were going to do in the part 2 and what was approved in the part 2, we actually did. And even if you're not doing work in a portion of your house, we still need photographs of that to show that, yeah, we didn't do any work on this portion of our house. So like I said, the process is similar for all 3 programs. However, there's different ways to apply for each one. With the Federal Historic Tax Credit, it's all hard copies. So you have to send in a hard copy of your application. You have to send in hard copies of photos, of the site key, architectural drawings. And you have to send in 2 copies because we keep 1 copy and we distribute the second copy to the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. So we review that first copy and we make a recommendation to DC. And then DC, the National Park Service, will make the final determination for your federal historic tax credit. With the state historic tax credit, that's completely online. So there's a link on our website you can go to with instructions that lead you through that process of the application. And as I said before, the state is just our office and the Department of Revenue. With the VIP program, that's a hard copy application, and that only comes to us. We only review that. We're in contact with the county assessor, and we give them the information that we've reviewed and if it's been approved, and we're in contact with them, but that's only approved by us. So when we review your project in that part 2, there's certain guidelines we have to follow, and these are called the Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. And these are 10 standards which are a series of guidelines about maintaining, repairing, and replacing historic materials, as well as designing new additions and making alterations. And so the standards can be applied to historic properties of all types, materials, construction, uses, etc. And we have to follow these again for the inside and the outside of the building. And I don't have all 10 standards listed out here, but this is what they cover. You have to adapt for compatible use and for code, protect and maintain and repair the historic features and materials. So this is part of the integrity of your building that made it eligible to be listed on the National Register or locally landmarked through CLG. So you want to retain those features. Replace missing components in kind where design is known. Got to review the interior and exterior and retain historic character and review new additions and alterations. So we're pretty much looking at every step that you're doing to this project if you're applying for any of the 3 programs. So as you can tell, there's a lot of planning that goes into this. And we always encourage people to plan ahead and keep us in the circle for when you're talking to your architect, if you're talking to code officials, if you're using other sources of funding. Sometimes our guidelines, don't mesh with their guidelines, and so we have to talk to each other and work something out for something that can be compatible for a good project. So, a lot of planning ahead. And I always tell people, if you call us up and you're like, all right, I took out my windows, got my windows ordered, started working on my roof, that's going to be problematic because, we have to look at your windows and see if they're deteriorated enough to replace. They may be in good enough shape where you can retain them. And if you can replace them, we have to look at the windows you're putting in to make sure they match the windows you're taking out. So there's a lot of planning that goes into this. And we always encourage people to, if you're thinking about it, just give us a call, ask us any questions you have, big or small. And I just wanted to quickly show you a project that used the federal and state historic tax credit out in Chadron, Nebraska. The center picture is what it looked like when the part 1 came in. So it was in rough condition. It has a sandstone exterior, and that had worn over time, and it had some cracking and some problems. The depressed metal at the top and the cornice and the pediment, it had problems as well with rusting and needed to be painted. And the historic storefront was totally missing. It was replaced in the 1950s or 60s with the storefront that you see. So we had good evidence of what the storefront looked like historically from photographs that existed of the building. So we can see on the picture on the left that it had big picture windows. It had these big sandstone pillars out the front, and it had a recessed entryway. Well, since those sandstone pillars were gone, we weren't going to make them go out and get new sandstone pillars, but we could put in something that mocked something that would have existed there historically or examples that existed within the community. So the picture on the right is the finished product. You can see it has the big storefront windows, it has transom windows, it has a recessed entryway, and these are all things that would have existed on this building historically and in adjacent buildings nearby. And also all the work they did to the exterior, to the sandstone, and to the pressed metal cornice and pediment up there. And so that took a lot of conversation. That was a lot of conversation between the owner, between our office, between the architect, between the consultant that was working on it, between code officials. But it came out to be a really good project. And so when they were working on the storefront, they had to submit a lot of drawings to us. of the current storefront and what they were going to replace the storefront with. So as you can see here, here's a couple of elevations, and we have some profiles showing detailed measurements. So we can get an understanding that it's just not a flat storefront, that it actually has dimension to it, it has depth that you would have seen in a historic storefront. And we have images from the exterior and interior. And even though this project didn't have any work on the interior, we still had to get photographs of the interior to acknowledge that, yeah, you're not doing any work on in the interior. And when you turn in your part 3, it shows that you didn't do any work at all. So this turned out to be a really great project. A lot of planning went involved, but it was extremely successful. And that's all I really have to talk about. I've got our contact information up here with everybody involved. And I'm going to turn it over to Adam with REO, who's going to be fielding your questions through chat.
Yeah, my name's Adam Sitzman. I work at BVH as an architect, and I'm also a board member for Restoration Exchange Omaha. We advocate for preservation through education and different events. So check us out online if you haven't heard of us. If you guys have questions, just use the chat feature on Zoom to submit some questions, and we'll go through them as they come in. And we'll be ending at 1 o'clock. So any remainder questions, we'll be sure to try to delegate those to those that can answer, and they can reach out to you. To start, we have a question that says, if my building is listed on the National Register, does that mean I'll have to get permission to do any work, such as painting?
Yeah, and I tried to touch on that a little bit at the beginning, and the short answer is no. That, at least from a National Register standpoint, there may be that kind of bleeds into Kelly's program. If you have a local ordinance, there may be something there that you want to check with your local ordinance with, or your local government. But from a National Register standpoint, no, there's no restrictions on, especially something like paint colors, but even any other alterations that you may be planning, so long as you're not bringing in federal funds, permits, or licensing.
Next question is, if I'm using tax credit, can I pick which work applies for the tax credit and which work does not?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. No, you can't. And basically what's being asked is, okay, I don't feel like having the standards apply to my windows, so I'm not going to use the tax credit on my windows, but I want to use the tax credit on my floor and get money for that. You can't separate it up like that. It's all or nothing. So we have to review everything that you're doing on the inside and outside of your property.
Are there any costs to becoming a certified local government?
No, there are not. It's a free program, just like being listed in the National Register. There's no cost associated with getting a property listed unless you use a consultant or something, but any community is eligible to apply. Oh, Adam, you are muted.
Yep. A follow-up question is, Kelly, you mentioned that you're training for CLGs. Do you have any training sessions planned for this coming year?
We're using this webinar right now. And then we are also co-hosting a webinar next Wednesday that we're doing with the Nebraska Main Street Network. And then we're going to talk to other communities across the state that are not in the Lincoln, Omaha area. So we're using those as some training. We don't have any other formal training planned at this point in time.
Okay. How soon after submitting part 3 do you usually receive your funds?
Well, when you do your part 3 for the tax credit, you have to move on to a different application for the Department of Revenue or the IRS. And so I think Lee's on here from the Department of Revenue, so she could answer that question.
Right, I can talk about the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit. Once the SHPO's office has approved your work and approved the Part 3 application, you will need to submit a Part 4 application. The Part 4 application includes listing your eligible expenditures, documenting the invoices to us, and then we review those applications and issue certificates evidencing the credits. Right now, once we receive the application, we have 60 days to review your application and certify the credits, unless we need an extension because the applicant hasn't submitted the correct documentation. We can extend it with an agreement by the taxpayer for an additional 30 days.
The next one is, do paint colors need to be approved if part of a CLG?
It all depends on what your local ordinance says. We don't require language like that in your ordinance, but if something like that is important to the community, then they can put that language in their ordinance.
Great, thank you. Can you add floors to a historic restoration project to make it feasible? For example, adding an additional level of housing to make the project pencil out.
That's tricky. Typically not. It depends on the design you're going to do. If you're going to put a whole nother floor on the top, then no, you won't be able to do that. It depends on the location of the building, where it is, and you know, to adjacent buildings, how visible is that going to be seen? Because we have had projects where they add like a suite on the top or just a few number of apartments, but you know, we have to look at setback, how visible is it from the ground? So, I mean, it's possible, but if you're talking about just adding a full floor, all new walls on top of the historic existing walls, then that wouldn't be kosher with the tax credit standards.
After receiving money for Part 3 submittal, how soon after that can you work on your building? And what is the process for doing additional work after that?
Well, for me, I'll talk about the History Nebraska side of it. If you've completed your project and you've turned in your Part 3 and everything's approved, there's a 5-year recapture period after that with the federal and the state historic tax credit. So anytime you do any sort of substantial work, we need to be notified of what you're doing. And so I always recommend, if you're thinking about doing substantial work, give us a call. We'll talk about your project and we'll see if it necessitates a post Part 3 amendment. And what that amendment is, it's basically, okay, I'm going to do this work now, and then we have to review it against the standards. I mean, with us, after your Part 3 is approved, I guess you can move through and start doing other work. It's best to have that work part of your total project so you can, get those costs for that portion of the project. But if you have work that comes up afterwards that you want to do, there is that 5-year recapture period that you should contact us and let us know what you're doing.
Okay. What challenges do you most often run into with owners when working on tax credit submittals?
I think one of the big things is people have already started work. With the state historic tax credit and the VIP, the legislation says you're not supposed to start work until you submit an application, a Part 2 application. With the federal, you can submit if you've already started work, but it's really tricky because if your previous work as part of your total project doesn't, if it doesn't go along with the standards, then you're not going to get a credit. So that's probably one. Another one, I think windows are a big thing. People always want to replace their windows for thermal energy, even though a lot of historic windows are made out of superior materials. I mean, they've been around for 70, 80 years. And, if they have cracking paint and cracked glass, that's not reason to replace your window. And so, even with a good screen, storm window, you can get a pretty good thermal barrier there that is comparable to a new window. Those are probably the two things that come up with tax credits.
That is all the questions I have. Does anybody have any additional ones? Hearing none. Again, please refer to the slide. Please refer to the slide that's up right now for a coordination of any questions that you might have additionally after this presentation. And please visit the websites for additional information about the organizations. Any closing comments from the rest of the group?
No, feel free to give us a call if you have any questions. Let us know, if you want to get listed or thinking about CLG or
Right.
funded
And I
tax
did
credits.
notice there's a typo for my phone number. My phone number is 402-540-5847. Sorry, I didn't notice that earlier.
That's me. I messed it up.
The email address is correct though.
My bad. And
That's
I put
okay.
Lee's information on there because, like I said, with the Nebraska historic tax credit, if you have any tax questions regarding to that, the issuance of credits, go ahead and give Lee a call and send her an email.
But yeah, thanks everybody for joining. So we hope you enjoyed it.
If that is it, thank you all for coming today. We appreciate your attendance. And again, please reach out if you have any additional questions.